Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate author of Design, Control, Predict, Logical Governance in the Smart City, Aaron Shapiro, and the author of The Gentrification of the Internet, How to Reclaim Our Digital Freedom, Jessa Lingel. I'm Morella, the Events and Social Media Coordinator here at Flyleaf Books. Before we before we begin, if you have any questions during the events, you can put them in the chat or in the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of the screen, and I'll ask them towards the end of the evening. You can find out all about our other virtual events on our website, flyleafbooks.com, under the Events Calendar tab. If you'd like to make a donation to Flyleaf Books so that we continue to bring more events like this one, please click the donate button down below. And if you'd like to support tonight's authors in Flyleaf, we have copies of Aaron's and Jessa's books available for purchase on our website, on our shelves in the store, or you can also call the store. We got 3 different options for you. And now I'd like to welcome our authors for tonight. Aaron Shapiro received his PhD from the Edinburgh School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania and is currently an assistant professor of technology studies in the Department of Communications here at UNC. Go Heels. His research examines the cultural and economic impact of new media technologies and infrastructures. Aaron's writing has appeared in Nature, New Media and Society, Media, Culture and Society, and Surveillance and Society, among other outlets. And his first book, Design, Control, and Predict, Logical Governance in the Smart City, was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2020. He lives in Carrboro, where you can catch him biking around with his son Nico and wife Natalie. Jessa Lingel is an associate professor at the Edinburgh School of Communication and core faculty in the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Study program at the University of Pennsylvania. She received her PhD in Communication and Information from Rutgers University. She has an MLIS from Pratt Institute and an MA in Gender Studies from New York University, NYU. Yeah. Her research interests include digital inequalities and technological distributions of power. The Gentrification of the Internet is her third book. I'm going to minimize myself now so we can focus on the authors, but I'll pop back in 40 or 45 minutes to moderate the Q&A section. Thank you.
Cool, thank you. And thanks to all the folks at Flyleaf Books for organizing this talk. I'm very pumped to share a screen with Aaron. And the way we thought we would get started is by introducing each other's books. So I would like to start by introducing Aaron's book, Design, Control, Predict. Digital technologies are here to stay, so the question is, how do we live with them? Design, Control, Predict, Logistical Governance in the Smart City is a book that asks questions about how we live with the digital technologies that are reshaping city space. Most smart city technologies want to stay invisible with the goal of embedding themselves in infrastructures so that they see without being seen and detect without being detected. And one of the gifts of this book is that Aaron peels back the layers of city streets and sidewalks in order to show us the algorithms that are shaping urban power dynamics, from policing to delivery people to reimagined payphones. Methodologically, Aaron's work leverages a number of ethnographic approaches, including institutional ethnography at Hunch Lab, a startup working to create predictive policing tech, and working as a caviar delivery person. This approach has meant that he's been able to gather grounded, holistic accounts of changing relationships to labor and agency in the context of a rapidly changing workforce and rapidly changing ideas about policing city streets. In addition, Aaron uses a combination of interviewing and textual analysis to conceptualize data ethics as they manifest in design plans for Link NYC, a highly contested initiative reshaping New York's urban landscape. Bridging these different cases requires a sophisticated and confident theoretical analysis, which is where Aaron's omnivorous approach to theory really benefits this book. Drawing on theorists like Desserteau and Latour, Aaron has built an analytical framework that demonstrates how mechanisms of control manifest in these different digital interventions. With these theorists in tow, he develops a new lens for interpreting urban technologies, logistical governance, to critique an urban future based on extraction and rationalization. With an eye towards implications for social justice, Aaron notes how technological distributions of power are uneven, privileging some people and circumstances over others. These arguments are engaging from an academic perspective, but they're also utterly crucial in terms of thinking about urban policy and social equity. Design Control Predict shows us the smart city as a network of technologies and also a process of logistics. And instead of the 10,000-foot view of urban logistics, Aaron's multifaceted ethnography moves from city block to city block, infrastructure to infrastructure, and node to node. As Shannon Nattern wrote in her review of Aaron's work, this book reveals how each node in that global assemblage is itself a logistical network within which algorithms orchestrate the circulation of bodies and bicycles, carceral logics, and cybernetic imaginaries. What I appreciate most about this book is its conceptual depth, its close-up take on the lived consequences of data, and its insistence that carving out some spaces of resistance is possible. Logistical governance can feel all-encompassing while being insidiously hidden, but there are still possibilities for what Aaron calls counterlogics. These are a resistant mode of repoliticizing city space, which suggests a path for liberatory lines of flight within city space. I'm really excited to get to share a space to talk to Aaron about this book.
Thank you for that. It's so nice, to not have to, when we live with these books for so long, to have to rehash it all. But also, you make me sound very smart, and I appreciate that. I want to thank Flyleaf for having us, and I'm equally delighted to introduce Jess's new book, The Gentrification of the Internet, which I lovingly have. The conceit of the book is that gentrification is a critical concept, not only for thinking about the corporate hijacking of digital culture, but for developing strategies and tactics that everyday internet users can use to resist power and capital, both online and off. Jess's book is not for academics. It's written for activists and communities that have been sidelined, excluded, or deemed less than by platforms, business models, and infrastructures that have been engineered to maximize profits over public good. As Jessa notes in the introduction to her book, getting by without interacting with big tech in some way, right, is not really an option anymore. Now, this infrastructure-like quality to the internet and the platforms that populate it today suggests pathways for thinking the internet through the urban and vice versa. Because network technologies are no less a part of everyday life than streets, sidewalks, traffic lights, or any other system that facilitates and governs our shared experience of the world. In cities, we have the language and politics of gentrification to name the forces of exclusion and exploitation. What this book does is bring that same focus, that same critical indictment to the internet. So there are plenty of qualities to admire about this book, from the clarity and accessibility of the writing to the kinds of insights that can only come from years of teaching, fieldwork, and activism. I'd like to briefly highlight three things that I think make this book particularly exceptional, though. So the first is how the chapters sketch the contours of a much wider ecosystem of gentrification on the internet than one might initially expect. So the case studies range from the ways that social media platforms govern their user bases, to the racial and gender gaps in tech company C-suites, to the political economy of internet infrastructure. So as one goes along with Jessa on this tour of the internet's gentrification, the scope of the intervention and the situation that we're in zooms out. It widens to this much bigger social, political, and economic landscape. And while Jessa toggles back and forth between physical and online spaces throughout the journey, the reader does not get dizzy. The second aspect that I think that's worth mentioning is Jess's prescription for pragmatic workarounds and ad hoc alliances as a kind of resistance to the status quo imposed by a gentrifying internet. So I'm thinking here, for instance, of what Jessa calls the radical democracy of mesh networks and the activist promise of millions of miles of fiber optic cable left dark and untouched beneath our city's streets. Demanding access to that cable or building out community mesh networks gives us something to work with. It gives local activists concrete strategies to push back on, get around, or simply demand something better from unaccountable, monopolized internet platforms and providers. Equally important in the same vein are the concrete analogies that Jessa gives us to think with. So why, for example, do we reserve space on cable television for public access, but hand over the entirety of internet infrastructures to a handful of megacorporations? Why do we demand of Hollywood racial and gender parity and the auto industry more green technologies, but unquestioningly accept tech companies' homogeneity and their pursuit of monopoly at the expense of democratic norms? The third thing worth noting is Jessa's vision for what online communities could be. This vision draws on her experience of and research with practitioners of the early internet, but it avoids romanticizing a bygone era. For example, consider Jessa's treatment of filter bubbles. We might be inclined to think of the gentrified internet as problematic because social media algorithms automatically sort users into groups based on some affinity that the platform deems profitable. And of course, this idea is closely associated with the perils of disinformation and polarization. But Jessa reminds us that filter bubbles are not really an internet phenomenon at all. So to quote her here, the promise of early digital communities was that they would get us outside of the filter bubbles of school, work, and worship. Pushing back on IRL, in real life filter bubbles, is a potential benefit of online communities that mainstream social media platforms increasingly deprioritize. So in other words, the gentrified internet didn't create filter bubbles. It exacerbates the kinds of segregations that a more community-oriented internet could actively work to resist, right? So while the early internet was not perfect, it had its own kind of exclusions built into it. When we recognize that the ill effects commonly associated with algorithms are in fact human tendencies, the book gives us something tangible to work with. After all, what better example of a filter bubble is there than the residential segregations of urban gentrification or the lack of diversity at Silicon Valley's elite tech companies? So the gentrification analogy that structures this book is in the end more than an analogy. It's a way of naming and framing connections between commercialization, displacement, and isolation. By showing us that these problems are interconnected, both online and off, the book makes a strong case that it's not only possible to do something about it, but that it's critical that we do so.
You also made me sound very smart, so thank you. That was very kind. I am deeply appreciative of that introduction of my book, and also relieved not to have done it myself. So what Aaron and I wanted to do was, instead of a normal book talk where you read an excerpt, which I personally find a little bit weird in the academic book genre, as opposed to like a poetry reading where that makes more sense, we thought we would sort of ask each other questions about writing and about writing these books and about scholarship. And I'm sort of looking forward to feeling like this is more of a conversation than sort of, I don't know, a traditional book talk lecture. So maybe I can get started, Aaron, and ask you a question. I love talking about the methods that inform a book. And as I mentioned when I was introducing your book, I think the methodological approach you took was so rich and robust and multifaceted. I wanted to ask you what fieldwork looked like for the different case studies of this project, and also to ask, were there methods that you wanted to use and maybe weren't able to, and then you sort of had to shift? So what did fieldwork look like, and what would you have liked to have done that maybe wasn't possible for some reason?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, field work for this book was ad hoc by necessity, as you're kind of alluding to. There were things that I would have liked to do, and I was shut down kind of immediately. This idea of studying up, so studying organizations or institutions that are powerful has a lot of challenges, and there were surprising. There were things that I found surprising about what I was pursuing. For example, like I wanted to study predictive policing, and I found that they were the most welcoming of anyone that I wanted to talk to. When I was working as a Caviar courier, as a courier for this on-demand platform called Caviar for food delivery, I had reached out to the company saying that I wanted to, the original idea was to study the room where the dispatchers work in San Francisco. So I imagined, because I've never seen one of these rooms, but a room full of 15 people overseeing, each with like a God's eye view of the urban market where all the couriers are. And the company was like, no, you can't do that. So it was kind of on the fly that I decided to like do the work of like doing autoethnography while like riding a bike. So I developed a Google form for myself that I would like fill out on my phone while I was biking around between jobs. I would like pause and take notes on what had just happened. So yeah, all kind of like ad hoc and tactical. Link NYC was like, how do I even study this giant infrastructure? And so I ended up for that, like filing a Freedom of Information law, they call it in New York State, Freedom of Information law request with the city of New York to learn more about this competition that the city had held to design the new digital payphone, the new Wi-Fi infrastructure. And just getting a list back of names, like designers' names, and then the name of their entry, no contact or anything. So that was like a bunch of internet sleuthing, and then finding designers that would be willing to talk to me. So yeah, just by necessity, kind of all over the place. And I think that's, I don't know, maybe like pretty typical of both researching up and researching, new media institutions.
I think for a lot of people, so it's interesting. I think that the predictive policing people wound up being the most open because you would think of that as maybe being the most controversial. But for folks who have tried to do research in the tech industry, it's maybe not surprising that Caviar was like, oh no, you're not going to see this room. But that the folks at HunchLab who would be sort of more open as a smaller company. But I don't know if it's, being a former librarian nerd, that for me, what I found, I loved the sleuthing part that led to the insight into Link NYC, because I've also written about Link NYC, and I also face that difficulty of like, how do you study this infrastructure? Like how do you approach investigating this thing that's just grafted onto city streets? And I'm glad I did actually talk to people who were using it in the first 6 weeks before it totally got shut down. But I thought you were able to answer a totally different set of questions by doing that sleuthing to find people who had pitched these other ideas about what these reimagined payphones could be. So for me personally, that was like the most compelling, like the big reveal of your sources was like, oh wow, you really dug in and like found these folks. Were they willing to talk to you, or like how easy was it to get those folks to talk to you about? Because I know some of them were like, oh no, we never expected to win. We kind of just did this for kicks. So
yeah, there's a lot of that. But a lot of people who entered were like students at the time, or they were like design professors. Anyone who was affiliated with the university was like totally open to talk with me. It's kind of weird that most of the research I did for this New York City infrastructure was from a computer in Philly. But yeah, I mean, I think that the sleuthing is like when Jessa in your work on LinkedIn, I say you interviewed people who were using the machine. So I don't have any of that in my case, but you know, looking at what I was trying to do in that case study was capture like the diversity of this sort of like blue sky approach to like what could a 21st century payphone be, and the ideas were all over the place, and all of that kind of gets like systematically hacked away until it conforms to you know, the circle becomes a square peg, or whatever that analogy is. So yeah, that was fun. I don't have any methodological questions for you, although I could ad hoc one in a moment. I just wanted to get a better sense about you know, just to have you talk a little bit more about like this this idea of the internet as a gentrified space. So I guess this is kind of a conceptual question, but you know, you kind of suggest in the book that there's a spatial process to gentrification. There's also a temporal process. Like gentrification unfolds over time, and it like it inherently involves space. How is your thinking about the internet as a kind of space changed as you were like developing the argument for this book?
Well, it's funny because I used to be very opposed to the idea of using spatial metaphors to describe the internet. And that's really how people made sense of the internet in the late 90s, early 2000s, was these spatial metaphors of like, we're surfing the web and it's an information superhighway. And we're like, even website is like a very spatial metaphor. And I thought that that was kind of misleading for how, you know, this idea that like the internet is separate from our everyday lives. So even, you know, pre-Web 2.0, I didn't like the idea that we would think of the internet as a place that we went to, because it was more of a thing that we brought with us as we go through other parts of our everyday lives. But over time, I have completely reversed my opinion about this. And now I think that spatial metaphors are actually very helpful for the internet, at least as far as the specific question of how we treat each other, because the idea of going to a different space and there being different rules that we sort of implicitly buy into, this is a normal thing that we do, right? Like we behave differently in church than we do in school, than we do at a public park, than we do at a singles bar. Like we have, you know, every society has these different rules of how you behave in certain spaces. And also thinking like in activist spaces, there's often these rituals of like, okay, we're going to lay ground rules. These are the obligations that we have to each other. And so over time, when I have thought about how different groups of people make the internet meet their needs, spatial metaphors began to reassert themselves in this way that I found, you know, not interesting in terms of, oh, I'm going to explain the internet to you, because that's sort of not the tool that I want to. I mean, that was how metaphors of space were being used initially, but rather like the spatial metaphor as a way of helping us understand what our obligations to each other are when they're mediated through digital technologies. So once I sort of landed on that, it became like I became more okay with the idea of thinking of the internet as gentrified. And the concept itself kind of came from my last book, which is about Craigslist. And I was writing about Craigslist, people would use these metaphors over and over again of like, oh, the internet is Craigslist is part of the poor people's internet. Craigslist is part of the forgotten internet. Craigslist is part of like the old internet. And as I started thinking about the internet in that way, I realized like, oh, there are these platforms that have, very stubbornly held on to an older way of being online. And those platforms trying to make it as the rest of the world moves on, that's not just like incidental. There are like larger forces that make that happen, larger power dynamics that make that happen. And that's what started to bring the idea of gentrification for me. And then I wrote a blog post about it, and people really responded to that. And so I was like, I'm just going to write a very short book that is not for academics. I was like going up for tenure, and I was like, this book, I can do whatever I want with this book. My tenure packet is in. I don't have to write a book for like a tenure review committee. I can just like write this other very short book. So it kind of came out of a shifting idea about the internet and space, and also sort of like a very slow process of thinking about how the internet, like how shifts in digital culture have these important parallels and shifts in power dynamics in urban space.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the most like immediate thing that I like the Venn diagram space with like the flipping that on its head, right? So like thinking about gentrified urban spaces, in fact, in some ways, kind of mimicking the experience. That maybe it's like a dialectic or something, but like physical spaces and like the way that they're designed and engineered, then mimicking the experience of being online and managing online space, as you say, like especially with the platform economy and gig work stuff, the sort of like the expectations that we have about what it means to interact and transact online. How do we make urban space to be like to be that? Because that's obviously catering to this set of consumption preferences. And then that's just like that idea of making the city more like the internet in a way, kind of inspired this whole round of tech sector investment in these startups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. I wanted to go back to, you mentioned when you were talking about methodology, studying up. And I guess I wanted to ask about the sort of ethical, for me, in rare cases where I have studied up, there's sort of like these tensions around like, oh, how do I represent people who have, any participant that lets you into their world a little bit, you owe a debt that you kind of can never repay. It sort of creates this ethical tension of like, well, how do I represent people if I disagree with them? And I was wondering if you could also talk about that in terms of when you're interviewing caviar, drivers. In a weird way, as a graduate student, I've always felt like you occupy this like odd class status where you're usually not very well paid, but there's like you could almost leave and then like be a very highly educated person, and therefore like probably able to make, so it's like this weird liminal status. And so I was wondering about like the ethical tensions that you found of like studying folks that were doing the same job as you, but also like probably had a different relationship to that work, versus studying a group like Hunch Lab, where you're studying up, but also want to do right by them in terms of presenting an analysis that might be conflicted in some ways.
Yeah, that's a great point. To introduce a little bit more about Hunch Lab, that's the name of a predictive policing platform that was produced by a privately owned Philadelphia software company called Azavia, and they have other products that are like very pretty benign things like software to facilitate voter registration and tree mapping. They do a summer of code where they bring in high school kids and match them with graduate students in GIS departments. So it's a pretty cool organization in general, and they had this predictive policing product that has a peculiar history. Like we kind of like, all of a sudden in like 2013, 2014, all of a sudden predictive policing was a thing. But it turns out these companies that were offering the software platforms have their own histories. And Hunch Labs is that the guy who started Azavia, the software company, had worked for the Philadelphia Police Department as a crime analyst, and had developed a system for the police department he called it crime forecasting, and it was kind of his baby. It was like one of the first things that he did, like in the late 90s, so kind of CompStat era policing. And he developed it and he brought it with him and got NSF, National Science Foundation, grants to develop it. So it was very much this, they had this sense that they could do predictive policing and make it align with their sort of wider profile. They wanted to be the ethical option in that field. And that's kind of why they let me come in and hang out with them. They put their money where their mouth is. They said they were committed to transparency. And yes, there's this, in terms of cultural capital, I fit in perfectly at the Azavia office. I mean, look at me. I mean, like it's, you know, it looked like a tech office, and there was plenty of times where when I was on in the field with the Hunch Lab team, people just assumed I was a programmer or something, and I didn't correct them, which is, you know, something totally different. Yeah, totally different than the Caviar workers. So when I said setting up with Caviar, like this idea of wanting to go to their headquarters and observe their dispatch room, when I pivoted to do autoethnographic research and to interview other workers, yes, there is definitely, like, I would not call that studying up by any means. At the time, in 2015, 2016, most of the gig workers were like predominantly white college students, which it just kind of speaks to how rapidly the gig work universe has churned out people. Because while I was there, like, the working conditions deteriorated like significantly. When I started, got paid $10 flat fee per order, and you could like make $30 an hour very easily. And they quickly, like, they built up this base of workers and then just like changed the entire way that the system worked. All of a sudden, your payouts were based on algorithmic calculations of distance and cost and all these things. And yeah, when I was interviewing people, they were already talking about leaving, and then they, you know, they lower the expectations with the next round of people who come in, and then they continue chipping away at what the quality of work is in terms of how people are managed and what the pay looks like. So yeah, I mean, there is that weird like graduate student thing in the Caviar situation. Like I quickly realized how it like exploitative and like not nice the job was. So it was commiserating with people. So that wasn't really difficult to talk to them. I was like, can you believe this new thing that they put on the app? Or like when they started asking us to set our schedules ahead of time, because it was like totally free for all in the beginning. You could just log on whenever. So yeah, the commiserating was easy, and then we would talk about bike stuff. So that was fun.
I mean, I feel like every major gig work platform has followed that cycle, though, of they lure you in, and it seems like a pretty reasonable way to make, you know, it lives up to the promise for a brief window of time, and then once they have that army of people, then they reduce conditions, but people who are hooked, or who can't find other work find work. So I mean, I do think it's not framed that way in the book per se, but I do think that cycle and identifying that cycle is one thing that your work points to as, like, you know, you see this again and again with these like algorithmic sorting, you know, that's actually the thing that reduces the conditions of working so that it no longer lives up to the promise.
I have a question for you, Jessa. You end the book with this toolkit for fighting back against the gentrification of the internet. You have this prescription that I love, in part because I'm teaching an algorithms and society class right now. But your prescription, your recommendation is to be your own algorithm. What does it mean to be your own algorithm online? And what does it mean to be your own algorithm offline? As like as an ethos of being an urban dweller or citizen?
Oh wow, no one's ever asked me the second half of that question before, so thank you. So I as tired as most people who have been studying the internet for a decade of reading really cynical, skeptical takes that offer no path to like how things could be better. And even though I know the things that I offer at the end are these like small steps, I do think that even small steps are an important start, you know, to a path to sort of trying to reclaim some sense of autonomy. So I can tell you what being your own algorithm has meant for me. The only platform that I use with any regularity is Tumblr, right? Like that's the only social media platform that I use. And I have many Tumblrs. I have a Tumblr for sad bikes, which is like, you know, decrepit bikes, partially stolen bikes. I have a Tumblr for payphones. So I'm a big Tumblr user. But the thing that came across my Tumblr feed were very reflective of things I was already interested in. So I would, you know, like books and librarians and academics and like things about like how academia sucks, like all of that was like very well represented. And then I was like, man, I am not following my own advice as far as filter bubbles. So I took a very conscious step of following Black women comedians. And many things happened. So like my feed obviously became a lot funnier. But then also there were suddenly all these different cultural touchstones that I had no idea were out there and that I was suddenly learning about and that I was deeply appreciative of being exposed to, like these different ideas, these different debates that were happening, these different cultural references. And Tumblr makes it very easy to do that. You know, you can just kind of like go out and like find stuff and follow them. But I really believe on any platform, you can take these small steps of like forcing yourself out of these filter bubbles and exposing yourself to new content. So if you feel like you're like, I just don't know what's going on in rural America, you can just find people to follow in rural America and then sort of like be exposed to this different worldview. People of different ages, people of different geographic locations, people with different careers. So that's my vision of being your own algorithm. My first impulse to say, like, what is the counterpart to that in urban space would be to, you know, there would be to get a bike and then to like bike in different neighborhoods, because I do think that that's a powerful way of getting to know the city. And actually for the Craigslist book, one thing that I loved about that book was I was just biking all over Philadelphia to meet people. You know, I was just biking I did one interview in like a Burger King in Germantown, and I was like, man, like I've never been up here, you know? So, but there's another way of answering that question, which is so much of the arguments that came from the Gentrification of the Internet book came from attending local zoning meetings. I felt like I was having the same conversations over and over again with like, you know, other aging hipsters who like live in gentrifying neighborhoods, and we all feel this sort of like, oh man, gentrification, we're contributing to it, but we don't want to. What can we do? And it was really when I started going to local zoning meetings that I actually got to see some of those debates happen in a very material way. So it wasn't just people griping. It was suddenly like, no, this building is supposed to go up right here. And the wonderful thing about zoning meetings is someone has to be there to defend the building that's violating a code. Sometimes it's the lawyer, sometimes it's the architect, sometimes it's a realtor, sometimes it's the owner, but someone has to be there. And so if you've ever been in a gentrifying neighborhood and you're like, who thinks this building is a good idea? Like, why is someone planning on building this monstrosity here? You go to the zoning meetings and you actually get to see the person in the room. Like, what I love thinking about is like, I can't imagine what that counterpart in an online space would be like. You know, if there were like a change to a policy or some sort of feature was being rolled out, and like the program, like the design lead actually had to be there saying like, this is why we think it's a good idea. Like, that's a kind of transparency that's actually much more meaningful than how some people talk about transparency. Like, oh, if we could just see the algorithm, like, I'm not going to understand the algorithm, but I would like to actually see and talk to the person who thinks it's a good idea to roll out this feature, sunset that feature, you know, roll out this policy, not that policy. So I don't know that the answer the second part of my answer is like on point to your question, but it's definitely sort of like what got me thinking about parts of the book and what resistance could look like.
No, I think that's a great answer. Because another thing that I wanted to ask you about, if you don't mind, is just like it's very clear in the book that that the book is for activists and community members, internet users of all stripes. But it's also clear that you were inspired by local community organizations and local leaders, and an activist ethos, more broadly. I was wondering, just like reflecting not only on this book, but your now 3 books and very impressive research teaching career and activist career, if you could speak to activism as a mode of thinking, as a way of seeing the world, and how that's affected the kind of research and writing and teaching that you do.
So a very common complaint of like every graduate student I've ever talked about is that there's not enough teaching about teaching, like that you're just sort of like thrown into the classroom, and I couldn't agree with that more. It is funny to reflect on the fact that I have learned so much more from activists than from any other academic about teaching. Like activist spaces have helped me rethink the classroom. Activist spaces have helped me rethink what deep listening means, or what, critical thinking means, or what accountability means. It's been very humbling often as like a cis white able-bodied person to enter into an activist space and then have to check my privilege. And I have found that so useful in my teaching work. So the main way that I see activism playing out is in my teaching. I will also say, though, that I have done some research that is in very direct collaboration with activist groups. And what I have found, there's all these different unforeseen challenges around, the time scale, the ways that one lesson that I have learned from this is, like, ethically, I believe I should always pay activists for their time doing research, just as I pay participants, for participating in research. But sometimes people experience payment as an obligation. Like activists operate in many of the activists I worked with operate in a very fluid timescale, and they're used to putting in work when they can. And as soon as you start paying them, they feel like, overwhelmed with the idea of like, now I have to put in 4 hours a week. And so there have been a lot of challenges too, in terms of like how to bring an activist mentality into the institution, even as all I'm trying to do to bring them in is to get them paid. So I've really learned a lot about sort of how to try and bend the institute. I think of it as like I'm trying to direct money from pen to activists, but there's another way of thinking of it, which is like you're still bringing someone into this institution that can be very uncomfortable in ways. But I guess the last thing I would say is, I try to be militantly optimistic about the potential for change, and it's not a thing that is natural to me. It is a thing that I have like insisted on learning and practicing, and I have learned that from activists. I don't know activists who walk into a space and think, we're totally screwed, no change is possible, but we're here anyway. You like have to believe that change is possible and doable from ordinary people in order to show up. And so I just try and bring that same energy and that same commitment to my writing, even though I know I have a lot more to learn from the activists in my life. I guess the last question I would have for you, Aaron, would be, where do you see the work, control, predict going? Where are these ideas taking you in the next project?
Thanks. Sorry, I'm just thinking through what you're saying about the activism. Yeah, I guess I don't have that activist ethos or rather I have the tendency to fall back and be like, look how bad it is. It's pretty bad. The work that I've continued from the book is like to continue thinking about platform capitalism and this future of work, but from trying to get at it from different angles. So with COVID and all, last year I spent a lot of time thinking about the ways that these companies were operating. Yes, like refusing to give hazard pay to workers. I tried to zoom out a little bit and think about some of the longer term impacts these platforms, like service platforms, food delivery, Uber, ride hailing, would have on the urban landscape. And that kind of led me down this rabbit hole into the world of dark stores and ghost kitchens and the repurposing of retail space that is a weird form of corporate gentrification of cities, where you have this like logistical function of fulfilling an order for a pizza or for 2 sweaters, taking over what used to be a far more diverse streetscape of independently owned businesses in that romantic ideal that we might have. But thinking about the going dark as foreclosing that main street vitality even further than simply having a Starbucks on every block, when every other block is a micro fulfillment center that you don't even see the inside of, where workers are managed in the same way that gig workers are, but you don't even see the conditions of their labor because they're not bringing you the food, they're just packing a box. So yeah, not a happy note.
Well, I'm fascinated by ghost kitchens, so I'm excited to see that you're headed in that direction.
Hi, I'm back again for the Q&A section. So we have a couple of questions. The first one is from Enzo, and it says, what was your favorite thing you found out during your research, or perhaps your favorite experience that you had during it?
Is that for both of us?
Yeah, either can answer.
Do you want to go first?
I think you should answer, Aaron.
My favorite thing about the research was, yes, even though I found like gig work platforms to be pretty exploitative of their workforce in a lot of ways that you can read about in chapter 2, I really actually kind of enjoyed the work of biking around and delivering food to people, especially when customers are nice to you. It's great. When customers are mean, it kind of sucks. But just I really got to know the city in a new way. Even my hometown, like just like finding new alleys and knowing when I would want to take them to avoid certain situations, or just, yeah, I loved biking around. I loved biking for work.
I think my favorite part was I really wanted the book to end with a discussion of like, okay, what are the victories, even if they're small, that activists have found in pushing back on gentrification? And I learned new things. I mean, I learned new things about different efforts around the US and, North America, where people have found these like ways to push back on gentrification, which I had always thought of as sort of basically impossible. And so taking the time to sort of research these small victories in places like Chicago and in the Bronx and a little bit in San Francisco and also in Montreal, like that was really encouraging to me. I was like, please let there be some positive examples, and there were, and that was really helpful and inspiring to me.
The next question comes from Hannah, and she says, I'm not sure. Oh, it seems like it's mainly for Jessa, and it says to Jessa, I'm not sure if you're entirely familiar with TikTok and its algorithm and the For You page, but can you talk about that and in regards with the filter bubble and how it may polarize people's opinions even more?
Which I heard TED Talk, but that's probably not right. Oh, TikTok. Yes. Okay. Yes. Okay. So what's interesting is like this like TED Talk. I was like, yeah, they probably have an algorithm for who they invite to speak on technology. It's like whatever. So there was a wonderful article about like the mediocrity of TikTok that sort of informs my thinking of this, and I'm assigning it in my pop culture undergrad class that I teach every year. And I think there's an every few years there's a new platform that gets labeled as like somehow disruptive from the past. But even when the platforms offer a genuinely new technology, what is very similar to the power dynamics or the patterns of human behavior that tend to follow. So even as TikTok has been very disruptive in some ways, like this unexpected success story for a lot of young folks. For one thing, it's like not that different from Vine. And for another, the whole way that algorithms are sort of pushing people into filter bubbles really does have these parallels to the same filter bubbles that we've seen on YouTube, you know, the same filter bubbles that we've seen on Facebook, where people are pushed into conversations that feel like a loop because it's the exact same viewpoint. And this article in The Mediocrity of TikTok Stars, to me, sort of makes it even more damaging from a mental health perspective, because actually it's not just like the viewpoints that you're getting are going to reinforce ideas about like vaccines or global warming or whatever political leader. It's also that the bodies that you're seeing are the only bodies that are, you know, that are out there, like the only bodies that should be visible, because it's a very similar group of people who rise to levels of success. So really, TikTok has some very pernicious filter bubbles, not just around content, but also the people who make it big are people who, especially we know young people, when they engage a lot in social media, there's a potential for mental health harms. And part of that is driven by, you know, body dysmorphia, very unrealistic ideas of what's attainable for most people in terms of how we look. So the thing I appreciate about your question, Hannah, is that it's not just about the misinformation campaigns. There's this like added dimension in terms of what appears normal to people about bodies, about femininity, about class, about race. So it's a doozy, you might say, of an algorithmic harm.
The next question comes from Garrett, and it says, what are the roles of formal nonprofits versus more informal grassroots organizations in the activist efforts you see? Also, what kind of mustard do you put on a soft pretzel? Okay.
I'm a honey mustard kind of girl, but I'm also vegan, so I have to be very careful. I recently learned that honey mustard often has mayo in it, and so I didn't know that. So it's, even if you're the kind of vegan who's willing to eat honey, there's like this whole other thing. So now I have to worry about that when I'm just trying to get a condiment for my pretzel. I would say I am only interested in activism that forms coalitions. I am only interested in, if you're really trying to do the critical work of solving problems, it cannot be done with any activist group alone. And when you look at the most successful activists and social movements, they're always built in coalition. And so to me, the interesting thing that I've started to think about more is like, how do you build coalitions with groups that have different policies or different viewpoints, but are aligned on a particular issue? And so I think there's very much a role for nonprofits who often have more of a policy take versus grassroots activism, which is often more, the outcomes that they're interested in aren't necessarily fought in terms of elections or policies. They're often taught more and very street-based or city-based initiatives. But I think the key thing is to be able to form coalitions. The thing I worry about with this question, Garrett, is in this climate that we have of sort of like calling out, we have done a lot of really powerful work for sort of like trying to hold people accountable for their actions. But I think it might actually make the work of coalition building harder. And so I'm interested in trying to think of how we can do that sort of like calling in work to sort of build coalitions, even in a way that doesn't ignore differences that are important, but acknowledges them and says we have to work together towards a common common aim. So I think there's a lot to be learned from grassroots activism. I get impatient with nonprofits that see no room for direct action, but I also get impatient with grassroots activism that is sometimes so focused on process that we can't actually progress to trying to take actions that would have change. So I think there's a lot to be learned. And I'm hopeful that there are models of coalition that we can learn that would be able to forge ties between those two sets of groups. Aaron, did you want to field the mustard question?
As spicy as it can possibly be is my island.
So it doesn't seem like we have any more questions from the audience, but a question that we always like to ask here at Flyleaf is, what are you currently reading?
I'm just trying to keep up with the readings that I assign my students. And we just read John Cheney Lippold's We Are Data.
Same. I'm teaching a class called We Are the 99% Media and Memory of Occupy, because it's somehow like the 10-year anniversary of the Occupy movement. And weirdly, the book that I am reading right now for that class has a very similar title called We Are Many, which is a collection of essays written immediately after Occupy. So I have really enjoyed reading it and going back to this like moment in like 2011 where, you know, people were very invested in this movement. So that's what I am reading lately, available from AK Press and probably also from Flyleaf Books.
I just also wanted to add that I'm reading 9 Perfect Strangers because I'm watching the TV show and reading the book.
So we're about to close out the event, and I'd like to end with a few reminders. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Jessa's or Aaron's books, you can find them on our website, in our store, or you can click the buy button down below. If you missed some of our conversation tonight or would like to share it with a friend, you can find it recorded on Crowdcast, and in a few days, it will be uploaded into our new YouTube channel. And finally, please keep an eye out for other upcoming events in our weekly newsletter and on our website under the Events Calendar tab. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you for supporting Flyleaf Books. Again, thank you, Jessa and Aaron. Round of applause.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much for having us, and thanks, Aaron. This is really fun.
Thanks for coming.
And thanks all 28 people for coming. I see you.